Hello, good evening, and a very big welcome, everyone, to Connecting the Dots Season 2. Yeah, hi, everyone. Hope everyone have had your dinner. And Connecting the Dots is a talk show, and each week features different healthcare professionals, patients, or caregivers who will share their insights and experiences with us. So we are basically here to help you to connect the dots. Let me introduce myself. My name is Kuek, and I'm a speech therapist volunteer for Aphasia SG and your moderator for tonight. Aphasia SG is the only non-profit organization in Singapore that provides support to people with aphasia and their caregivers. We run free community programs for them, and we are also involved in various outreach and educational activities. We are here celebrating Aphasia Awareness Month this month, and we have several outreach and activities lined up for the month. We are live tonight on Facebook. Hi, everyone. I hope we have more friends coming to join us. Yeah. And so please send in your comments, question, or anything you want to share in the comment section below, and we will definitely try to get them all along the way. Yeah, we are live tonight on Facebook, so please continue to send in your messages. You can send us a thumbs up if you are agreeable with what our speaker has to say today. Yeah. So tonight, what is the exciting topic we have is tonight we are bringing you yet another much talk about topic, especially in this pandemic, mental health and total wellness. We are really honored to have Jonathan Kuek, co-founder of Total Wellness Initiative, and he is currently a doctorate candidate and a mental health researcher. He is a strong advocate of mental wellness and strive to create intentional reflections and actions for us to take care of our well-being. So let's welcome Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Siwei.
Hello, how
Thanks
are
for
you
having
today?
me tonight.
Yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. Yeah. So, Jonathan, I've heard about the term mental wellness, and it means that you're able to think, feel, and act in ways that create a positive impact on our physical and social well-being, right? But this is actually my first time learning about total wellness. So I'm not sure if our Facebook audience here, is it your first time, knowing what is total wellness all about? Yeah. And so my first question to you is, what is total wellness, and really how is it differ from mental health? Yeah.
Right. So I think to better talk about this point, we first have to kind of discuss this idea of the notion of well-being, wellness, and the different domains of health that exist. So most popularly categorize the three domains of health are our physical, our mental, and our spiritual health as well. So some people consider the social domain of health, but broadly speaking, physical, psychological, and spiritual are the main domains of health. And then, feeding into these three domains of health, we have kind of different dimensions of wellness. And these dimensions of wellness provide us with a more concrete framework by which we can better talk about our overall well-being. So the term well-being kind of denotes a broader presence of our broader existence within this world. It's not so narrow and kind of encompasses the entirety of our experience. So for total wellness, we use kind of a 10-dimensional framework to basically view different aspects of our life that are important for us to look after, that will allow us to better ensure that we have good physical, mental, and also spiritual health. So, you have your psychological dimension of wellness. So these would be things like how our mind works, how we are able to kind of manage our emotions, manage the emotions of others in relation to ourselves. It's about, whether we have any mental health conditions. It's about our actual ability to think and process information. So different cognitive abilities. Um, so, taking care of our psychological dimension of wellness, you can use things like having a mood diary to kind of jot down your different emotions across a period of time, and different other ways that you can potentially go about reflecting and looking inwards to better understand your psychological states of wellness. So physical, this is the most broad domain because it encompasses a lot of our physical and sensory kind of needs. So things like, smelling a scented candle, taking a warm shower, having a warm meal, a lot of very basic biological needs that we experience, going jogging, things like that. So there's also the social dimension next, which involves, basically our relationships with society and also the community around us, the people around us, even maybe broadly speaking, our country and even broader, the kind of world that we live in as well. So things like, spending quality time with family and friends, things like volunteering, these are very helpful in ensuring that we have a good social dimension of wellness. Occupational, this is relating to work and our career. So, how we can take care of our occupational dimension of wellness, basically finding new ways to shake things up at work, doing things differently, finding an alternate way to do something, maybe trying to explore uh, more efficient ways to kind of work on things. It could be taking on side projects that you otherwise might not usually take on, something that aligns more with your own particular interests or passions. Um, and next, we have a more, I guess, a newer dimension that really hasn't surfaced until kind of about the mid 2010s when smartphones and all that became much more utilized within society. And that's the digital wellness. And we are still basically trying to understand how we can have a better relationship with our digital devices. And this is not limited to smartphones, it's even things like our laptops, our computers, different aspects of technology. All these fall under the digital dimension of wellness. And basically, in the world that we live in with so much technology, that's not going to go away. So how can we better have a relationship with our technology in a way that still allows us to live in a meaningful manner? So things like, setting aside dedicated no digital device time, muting notifications, making sure that these devices don't kind of overtake our lives and become the entirety of it. Intellectual wellness, this dimension generally relates to our innate desire and curiosity for knowledge. So, all of you are here today because you're curious, right? You want to learn something new. And I think that stems from, the human's natural desire to want to continually learn more, to ask the questions why, ask the questions what, how, and all these different, probing questions that help us understand the world that we live in more effectively. And I think by picking up new skills, opening yourself to new avenues of knowledge, all these definitely improve your intellectual dimensions of wellness. So, something like learning a new course, taking up a new language, watching videos online, picking up new skills. I think, during the pandemic, home baking became quite a trend. Many people started to do a lot of baking. And
Yes.
I
Even
think, yeah,
myself, we start to, my husband actually start to bake a lot more. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
yeah, correct. So, humans don't like to stagnate too long, and there's that innate desire to, explore something new. So the spiritual dimension of wellness tends to be a bit more abstract, and I usually liken it to a connection with something larger than ourselves.
Mm.
So this can be many different things based on your own individual needs. For some people, it's really a religion that helps them to ground their spiritual needs. For others, it could be, things like meditation or, a retreat to some kind of spiritual area that is known to, have that kind of spiritual energies. So it really depends on the individual. And that's why the activities that are consistent with your beliefs, your view of the world, and the broader so-called universe around us, these are things that will help improve your spiritual wellness. Environmental, so this is not to say, this is not the social environment. This refers to our physical environment and our relationship with it. So these days, I'm not sure if any of you realize, it's getting a lot hotter. So how can you manage this change in the physical environment? How can you still be able to flourish within this new physical state that we live in? Things like heading out to nature when the sun isn't so hot, noticing how the environment, your physical environment, it could be a physical workspace, it could be, your home office, it could be your home working area. All these are also very important aspects of environmental wellness as well.
Yeah, so Jonathan, before you move on, just want very curious. You talk about environment and office space and all that. So, does that include, the whether our our house, our office, is it a clutter and so on? Will that will also affect one of the our wellness, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially, during the start of the pandemic, when people were, all working from home, there was a huge issue with
Yes.
our physical environment, because, suddenly you had multiple people needing to find enough space and also the area where they can work, especially in people with larger families who live in smaller homes. It was much more challenging for them to be able to navigate that and kind of craft out different areas where everyone could work within the same space, but not also intruding on one another's space. So decluttering is a very good way to kind of feel better about the environment that you're in. It could also be, organizing your table in a way that makes you most comfortable. It could be things like, getting a fan for your room if it's too hot. It could be things like making sure that all your books and the different things that you have around your area is neat and tidy. So these are different aspects. And if you want to think about it from an even broader perspective, it's really about how your office workspace, for example, many people bring things to work so that they can feel a bit more at home, little pillows, little aspects that help them to remember home to a certain extent. And that's also, in essence, us, without even realizing it, trying to ensure that we have a good environment to work in, especially when we are not at home. Yeah, so
Yeah. Actually, it's really as simple as just having a fan that and really maybe adding a small plant is actually would make a lot of change in our wellness. So let's ask our Facebook audience. So have you all returned back to work, or you're still, working from home, and just like what Jonathan said, you having to adjust, sharing a space, looking for your own room, your own space, creating your workspace, yeah, during the pandemic. Yeah, do we have our audience here? Or we do have some students, some do you have to, make a lot of changes? Studying from Zoom online. Yeah, let's see. Oh yes, one of our audience, Kimberly, said that she definitely agree with you. She said that I have more friends moving out during the COVID times to have their own space. Yeah, you see exactly the point, right? Because when the house is so filled with people and really need to declutter. Yeah, yeah. So that's a lot of things have changed. Yeah, sorry to
yeah.
stop you there, but I thought it was really, environmental. Simple things can be done to actually improve on our wellness.
Correct, correct. It's very it's kind of, for some people it's very intuitive. If you're
Mm.
uncomfortable in a space, you will tend to change it. But for others, we kind of try and adapt within the space. And for some, you definitely can adapt quite successfully, but there are people who also would need some kind of changes within your physical environment. Some people cannot work at home, so they will go out to the cafes, they will go out to places where it fits them a bit better. And all these, if you don't kind of take these little steps on a daily basis, they kind of add up over time. And that's why you see people, snapping at their family members, at their significant others when they are all confined within a very small space. And it's this sometimes lack of awareness of this importance of physical space that we need to also bring up and talk about a bit more. And nowadays, when we talk about environmental, it's always about climate change, which definitely is a component of it as well. There are people who experience eco-anxiety, which is the anxiety that stems from the climate changing and also the lack of ability to effect change that is required. So there are people who worry very deeply about the future generations and how sustainable our current practices are. But in general, environmental wellness affects people both on the physical built environment kind of level and also the natural environment. Yeah. So let me just quickly cover the last two, which is the financial and creative dimension. So for financial, it's really about learning how to manage your finances well, and especially for younger people, we don't really think about this very often, especially people who are just coming out of school and all that. And I think a lot more people are getting involved in their finances at an earlier point in time. So things like learning about investment, and there are a lot of young people who got burnt playing crypto recently. So that's something that we need to be aware of as well. That financial well-being is also very, very important, because this causes a lot of stress for people, especially when we haven't managed to secure a good financial state. And lastly, it's really this dimension of creativity. And on the surface, creativity sounds like something to do with the arts, but it's actually a lot more than the arts. It's really about our ability to express this certain level of individuality about ourselves, things that help us to feel unique, and for us to kind of express our inner thoughts about different aspects of the world and how we interact with it. Things like our clothing, things like the way that we choose to carry ourselves, things like the way that we dye our hair, for example, have different hairstyles. All these go into basically expressing individuality to a certain level. So finding ways to express it is very important. Some other ways that are more arts related can be taking arts classes, dance classes, songwriting classes, music lessons, for example. So there are many, many different ways that you can indulge in your creative aspect of wellness as well. Yeah, so these are kind of the 10 dimensions that we generally work within when we talk about total wellness. And these will then feed into our 3 domains of health that we discussed earlier, which are basically the physical, mental, and also spiritual domains of health.
Okay, so wow, Jonathan, would you mind just putting that up again? I think there's so much to discuss from here. I just want to ask our Facebook audience, we're looking through this can I just say like a checklist, right? So 10 dimension of wellness is really, really very holistic that you have shared with us. Yeah, so everything that we do actually is a component that can help us to be better mentally, and it will translate to physical and spiritual as well. And so our Facebook audience out there, I saw someone say, oh my God, crypto, talk about the stress, which is what Jonathan highlighted, right? And I saw some of our friends say they are actually doing gardening more. Yeah. So what else? Let's just have a look at this list that beautifully put up. And what else have you been doing more? Maybe any of our Facebook friends here can share. What are you learning? A new language, for example, that I didn't know intellectually, the keen learner, being a keen learner actually would make a difference in our wellness. So I'm glad our friend here, Jeannie, actually said keen to learn more. So there you go. That's the intellectual part of wellness. And definitely, Jonathan touched on a key point, that's baking, gardening. Yeah, these have been coming up quite a bit, right? So what else? Let's see our friends. What else? Our Facebook audience, what are some of the changes that you have made throughout? You may not know there's actually part of wellness, but now from here you can see like volunteering. Our Aphasia SG volunteers, thank you so much, for volunteering with us, and now it's also actually part of wellness. Yeah, let's see. So I'm sure many people actually did a lot of changes, like more people are going for exercises during the pandemic. Yeah, but very interesting. So Jonathan, maybe you can you elaborate a little bit more about digital wellness, because this I think is like you mentioned, right? I think in one of our conversations you did mention that actually it's only 8, but you added 2. You think the other 2 that is new and is equally important, that's digital and, correct me if I'm wrong, it's digital and creative, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why do you think that there's this need to add in these 2 components, and when do you add in?
Right. So I think when we were initially looking at the 8 dimensions of wellness, which is a relatively well-used model of wellness already, we were also looking at other areas that were perhaps not represented. And that's where we identified, digital and creative as being 2 aspects that haven't been put in. So sometimes when we did our initial talks with the 8 dimensions, we were asked about, what if I like to do painting? What if I do art stuff? What if I do dancing as a way to, de-stress? Then where does that actually fall under within the 8 dimensions previously? So oftentimes we would have to get them to elaborate a bit more about exactly what kind of activities they're engaging in to better fit it in. But in reality, there was that key component, which was creativity, that was missing, and basically a way for people to express themselves through the activities that they do, that are not, falling strictly within the different other dimensions that exist. As for digital, I believe when the initial model was created, the digital aspect wasn't such a huge research component yet, meaning that back then when the model, which is I think is 2015 or 2013, digital wellness wasn't really recognized as a major issue at that point in time. So more people were more concerned with addiction and the harms of digital potential overuse of digital devices, rather than so-called how can we maintain a harmonious relationship and improve our digital wellness now that we live in a world where increasingly people are becoming very reliant on technology. And to say, even to put it as a reliance kind of issue, creates a very negative connotation whereby we can't live without our devices. But at the same time, I think it's very hard to not have a device in this time and age. So for the elderly and all that, there is that level of lack of this digital wellness there, whereby many of them struggle to pick up certain technologies, and then they feel very bad about themselves. Their self-esteem is lowered, and subsequently they get more frustrated when trying to learn all these different digital technologies as well. So I think with more research coming up and helping us to better unpack this domain of digital devices and their impact on the human psyche and the human, kind of existence, that we have decided that, perhaps it's also important to touch on this digital aspect and help people to find a good balance between both. So for some people, it's about how to use the digital devices less. For other people, it's about how can they use it more? How can they develop a better relationship with it? Yeah. So that's where.
That's
Yeah.
so true, Jonathan. I remember, when we first started our Aphasia SG, we have to go online and we have to actually teach, our caregivers, who are some of them are elderly, to learn how to use Zoom. And I could see the anxiety that they actually are facing. Whereas younger people, they actually scroll through. We have so many new apps coming out, TikTok, Instagram, and they continuously, how addictive it can be. You can just continue to watch a video after another. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Our Facebook friends here, yeah, some struggle really to how to use it, and some really just can't stop using them. Yeah, so thank you for the really great explanation and some of the suggestions that you put aside that we can adopt in order for us to have a more holistic care in terms of total wellness, right? And just another question that I would like to ask is, it has been trending about mental health and so on. Why do you think mental health and wellness is such a trending topic these recent years? Yeah, it
Right.
has been, every time when we read the newspaper or just among friends, this topic will come up. Yeah.
I think in large part, this acceleration towards greater conversation around mental health and wellness really stemmed from the pandemic. So many psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals were actually um, both happy but also very cautious about the pandemic because it's a double-edged sword, right? With more awareness, more people coming forward talking about these issues also means a greater load on the existing services, which may not be sufficient to actually accommodate a larger group of people suddenly coming forth. A surge in that kind of requirement for mental health services and other types of wellness services, and which is why total wellness kind of exists within a more preventive space. We don't have a more interventional active component. We try and kind of help people to be able to be empowered so that they don't reach a point where they need this type of mental health services, or even if they do, it will be in a less severe state than people who have not been able to take care of themselves over time for, based on circumstances or without realizing it, and subsequently, end up in such services. But I think that the pandemic has been a huge contributor. It's not only just the fact that the pandemic exists, but it's all the follow-up effects of the pandemic, which is the fallout of it, basically. So things like people losing their jobs, things like, the uncertainty, things like having a lot of time to suddenly reflect about the things that they are doing in life, and also the great shifts in different types of working arrangements and all that. All these cause a lot of stresses for people who aren't able to adapt as quickly as needed to the requirements. So I think that's where a lot more attention really came to the topic of mental health and wellness, even though advocacy efforts in Singapore have been around since even early as the early 2000s, where we have tried to increase awareness about mental health issues. And even when I started my journey within the field in 2014-ish, there wasn't really much conversation around mental health issues. But now we are seeing so much more, and it's definitely a double-edged sword, because with more information there's also the possibility for more misinformation to be put out there, and it's a danger that always exists when it comes to knowledge.
So there's more misinformation, and also there's more awareness that as our healthcare system and so on able to support when people are more aware. And yes, talking about uncertainty and so on, we have a question from our audience, Kimberly. So she asked, I'm wondering, how can we help improve the mental wellness of the elderly during COVID times? That's so true, because in a hospital, and sometimes the elderly, they used to go out, right? They used to go out, sit with their friends, chit chat, have coffee and so on. And suddenly with the pandemic, you have your circuit breaker and so on. They all have to stay at home, and that create a lot of an environmental change, right? Anxiety and so on. So how can we help, elderly to overcome and improve on this wellness? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge factor. And I think that was also, the pandemic is also one of the contributing reasons as to why we had such a high level of elderly suicides over the past, I think, 2 years-ish. And the unfortunate part is that when it comes to the pandemic and the movement restrictions that were enforced, there was very little that people could have done to actually improve the situation for the elderly. And a large part is because they are the susceptible ones to the COVID virus at least at the start before the vaccines and all that were out.
That's right.
Yeah, so the to kind of isolate them was to protect them, but at the same time it led to a whole other host of issues such as loneliness, isolation, and elderly, like you mentioned, they need that social connectedness, they need that relationship with other people. And in fact, one of the longest studies on human happiness and development over, I think it was about 70 or 80 years long study in the US. And the key finding was that basically relationships and the quality of these relationships were what predict happiness in the long term. So when we talk about how can we help the elderly, it's really finding a way to keep them connected, to keep them socially engaged. So this could involve checking in with them more often. It could involve teaching them how to use the digital devices so they could still, connect with their friends. So perhaps, even linking up with the families of their friends and kind of creating that network by which they still can communicate over digital devices. But the elderly also need to be willing to engage in such learning of how to use and all that. So it was definitely a huge challenge, and I think it still remains a big challenge now. But I think some elderly they just don't care, they just go out, whether they whether they are circuit breaker or not. So I think for them those relationships matter more than actually their own physical health. And that's kind of a judgment call that they should be given the right to make, I suppose, because it's, after all, it's their well-being at stake there.
So really getting them to be connected with people and engaging in conversations and so on would be the best way to to avoid to keep them basically to keep their social wellness better and up, although and feel less isolated. Yeah, it's actually really very sad that learning about elderly suicide getting more over the past 2 years. Yeah, really thank you, Kimberly, for that question. And no matter how busy we are, so Jonathan actually put out a point, is no matter how busy we are, we really have to spend the time to connect with our elderly parents, right? Yeah. So of course, during this with just now you mentioned about misconception about mental health, mental illness, and so on. So there's a possibility out there, right? So my question is that, what are some of the common fallacies about mental health and total wellness that you have encountered? And is there anything that you would like to, correct or bring out and create this awareness to our Facebook audience here? So to our Facebook audience, keep coming with all these good comments and good questions. How can we help our society to have better total wellness? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest fallacies is really that we need to be ill or we need to have some kind of condition before we actually seek help. So regularly engaging in preventive or early intervention kind of services such as health screenings, going for regular counseling, going to talk to people, engaging in conversations. All these are very important to do on a regular basis. Even though you do not have a mental health condition, counseling can be very helpful in general. So maybe once every 2 to 3 months you go and see a therapist or a counselor just to talk about your life and your issues and kind of work some of these things out. That can be very helpful. So seeking help basically needs to be a bit more to a certain extent easier in society. We should become a bit more willing to ask for help as well. I think that's one big thing that one of the fallacies that I usually come across. So another one is probably that people with mental health conditions do not want to change. I think that's something that is a big fallacy as well. And I think it's one that people find it very hard to understand because mental health issues tend to be unseen. And if you haven't experienced it for yourself, it's very hard to empathize with people who are experiencing them. But when it comes to mental health issues, there are so many different layers of how to say, challenges that people who have them face. Things like their own symptoms that they need to manage, their own self-esteem, and the way that they need to adapt to a new style of living to kind of manage their symptoms more effectively. So at times it can look like they're not trying, but I think it's important that we remain very patient and to understand that they did not choose this, and that they don't want to be in this state either. And I think that's very easily forgotten, especially if you've been supporting someone with such conditions for a very long time. Yeah, so another fallacy that I can think of is the how basically, if you don't have a mental illness, you don't have to take care of your mental health. Yeah, so I think
that's a good one. Yeah. So when you talk about mental health or mental illness, and it becomes so taboo, right? So everyone would just either avoid it, or they think that, oh, I'm actually feeling quite good, means I'm okay. But yeah, so that is something that often probably misread sometimes.
Correct. And I think it's because mental health issues tend to creep up on you. Things like burnout, things like depression, anxiety, all these, they don't come overnight, at least not very often. And things like PTSD, this is something that comes after an incident, normally, of something traumatic. Then that there are certain conditions that have a more immediate kind of onset, but things like depression, things like anxiety issues, they don't generally come overnight. So you don't realize it until you're stuck in it. And that's where by being very intentional and very proactive and reflective with ourselves on a regular basis, that's when we can be a bit more effective at picking up some of these early warning signs, for example. And also just to be a lot kinder to ourselves, I would say it's an important skill that many people need to learn. And it's very hard, especially in Singapore, where we are brought up in a hyper competitive society. Yeah.
I like what you say, self-compassionate. So one of our Facebook audiences, Kai, actually say, yeah, it's saying no. It's also a skill. So definitely this answer the question, right? Sometimes we really need to set boundaries and say no and be kinder to ourselves. And yes, as Siti Kai also said that, I'm glad there were programs to help the elderly go online during these times just to make the connection. And that's one of the direction that Aphasia SG also had to have to turn chit chat online very quickly. And as to what John said just now about empathy and so on, so we have Jeannie here who said that we should help people to increase their mental health vocab so they can explain better what they feel. And she also mentioned that we need to give time to people to process what is going on. Don't rush them or ask them to snap out of it. So some of the things we do is that we actually ask people to snap out of it and so on. But more importantly, we really want them to be more. We have to be a bit more patient and just sometimes lend a listening ear, right? Yeah. So actually, I have a question here, and which we will address later in the next few questions, actually. So yeah, so the next question, or rather topic that I would like to bring up is about anxiety, stress, and depression. And all these issues, sometimes people who just suffer a stroke or people with aphasia actually face. So a lot of my patients that I see in the hospital, when the first few weeks when they just have a stroke, they actually become more reserved, more quiet, and they do experience certain changes in their brain. And every time when there's an insult or injury to the brain, there's actually the brain tries to recover. So there's a lot of changes in the brain chemistry in that sense. And so they do have what we call a mental fatigue. Yeah, they get tired easier. And also because, especially for people with aphasia, when they lose the ability to speak, right, they would eventually become more reserved. Yeah, and sometimes you do get feedback from families like, "Wow, he or she doesn't want to practice, because I don't. Maybe he's just lazy, or don't want to do it." So we do know that there's a lot of anxiety happening, and just like what you mentioned about post-traumatic stress. So if they have a brain injury, there is also the trauma that's happening. So we do have a question here from the audience. He or she said that my husband suffered a stroke, and since then he has become very easily agitated. I feel that I'm also sinking into depression caring for him. What advice do you have for my situation? So this one we're talking about, changes in behavior of a person who had a stroke, and the carer themselves are also having some caregiver stress. Do you know what are some of the advice that you can give to help them to go through this period?
Okay, so I'm very sorry to hear about your husband, and I think it's definitely a very challenging situation to be in. And unfortunately, um, the best way I can think of is really to seek support from others. And especially if I'm not wrong, there is a support group for caregivers of people who have been through stroke. So I think joining some of these caregiving groups is very important because they have a broader, more specific base of knowledge. So the workshops, the talks they provide are based on the lived experiences of other caregivers who have been through, even if it's not the same, similar type of scenario, and they can provide perhaps tips and certain aspects and certain perspectives that can help you better manage your own feelings, and also kind of be able to support your husband better as he is in the recovery phase as well. So I think it's very important to have the right kind of support groups during a kind of when you're caregiving for someone experiencing any kind of condition. And thankfully, we do have a lot of these caregiving groups out there, support groups, caregiving support groups out there. So that's the first thing, is to get the right support networks. And then I would say the second one is to also really just be a lot kinder to yourself, to allow yourselves to feel the weight of the I don't want to use the word burden, but the weight of the challenges that you're facing, and also to not discount it and not kind of resign yourself to it. So by kind of flipping that script there, although it sounds easy to say, when you are able to embrace that and to kind of view it as a way to um, kind of challenge yourself in a certain way. So that has been found to be helpful for some people, although it's not a technique that works for everyone. But if you can see this caregiving as a challenge that you take on, and are empowered to basically learn how to do it to your best abilities, that can be a way to kind of flip the script on your current experience as a sufferer caregiver who has to be stuck with this person who doesn't seem to be able to come out of this situation that they're in. And I think the last point is really to seek professional help if you do require as well. So between the informal support, the formal support, I think there is a lot of ways that you can kind of release some of the frustrations that you feel, because oftentimes caregivers kind of keep it all in, and they need a way to be able to vent it out. And even if there's no solution to it, because oftentimes there isn't, just a simple act of venting it out and having other people understand the kind of struggles that you're going through can be very healing in itself.
Yeah, so Jonathan, you brought up very important points again about really self-compassionate self-care, and being a caregiver to a stroke survivor is definitely not an easy task because there are many things have changed. You know, I was just drawing back to a 10 dimension of total wellness. Yeah, environmental change, social change, and all that, and very important to click ourselves, get into support groups, and as well as seek professional help, and caregiver burnout and all that is really, really common. Yeah, so to seek help from, counselors, right, as you said earlier, getting help would be great. And here, actually, Evelyn, Evelyn Lee asked a very good question. Yeah, so she said, thank you for an excellent intro to mental wellness with the 10 dimension and dealing in particularly with the COVID situation, challenges for the elderly. Just wondering if you will be dealing with tips for mental wellness for those with aphasia. And that actually leads to my question as well. So as we all know, when it comes to mental health, and it comes to um, mental health, right? And we talk about people with aphasia, you know, they do have difficulty communicating itself, and they can't just go to any traditional session where you require them to talk and talk. But that is a difficulty on its own. So, do you know if there is, you know, any tips or any ways that you can share, yeah, to help them with this psycho-emotional issues? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think definitely in Singapore we still are at a rather early stage of our understanding of aphasia in general. Um, and you know there aren't many groups, as you have mentioned earlier, that deal with aphasia directly beyond the hospital setting, and also probably some other VWO settings which may come across people with aphasia. So definitely when language is kind of restricted, then you know you kind of have to move towards the non-verbal forms of services, which involve, you know, normally the arts, the music, the dance, the movement kind of therapies that exist. But the caveat there is that there are also not many people who are trained to deal to kind of manage specifically with people with aphasia as well. And therein lies the challenge in the Singapore's, you know, kind of mental health system, whereby there is really a gap that exists, whereby expertise in, you know, supporting people with aphasia is lacking to a certain extent. So there may be a couple of people who exist out there, um, but it's definitely going to require a multidisciplinary effort. So, you know, speech therapists working with psychologists very closely, working with psychiatrists, counselors, and all that, everyone coming together to kind of provide support for people with aphasia, and hopefully, you know, be able to find a way to help them still live the life that they hope to achieve as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you actually point out this fact about, you know, how we need to acknowledge that communication is not just talking, right? There's all the non-verbal form, usage of pictures and so on. That's where a supported conversation technique is very important. And yes, Aphasia SG is having a session on that, which I will share with everyone, our Facebook audience here tonight. And very importantly, yeah, as a speech therapist, I do find that sometimes it's very difficult for some counselors to, you know, engage with people with aphasia, and therefore engaging with a speech therapist if you need to have a session with them is equally important. Yeah, and I'm glad that you also talk about, you know, different activities that can help to uplift the feelings, right? So that we wouldn't have a sad crying face here. And Aphasia SG actually has Aphasia choir, really singing to have help them to uplift, just like what Jonathan said. These are some of the social activities and also creativity in your total wellness that helps. And we do also have arts and craft night, so doodling, and sometimes just like what John said, you may not really need to use words. Yeah, so with this arts and craft, you're learning a new skill. At the same time, you may not need to talk so much, yet you're enjoying and being part of an environment together. Yeah, so Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the great tips, and to our Facebook audience as well. Keep the question coming. We still have time, and also for PWA, and sometimes for our friends, caregivers, or even just healthcare professionals or anyone here tonight joining us. Yeah, sometimes. And I just want to bring back the topic about burnout and so on. You talk about seeking professional help. You talk about identifying, reflecting, and having awareness. So my next question to you is, when it comes to mental health and wellness, right? When exactly should a person seek help from a professional? So when do I know, okay, now I need to probably speak to a clinical psychologist, or I'm when do I know that I need to step and look for a counselor, or maybe just look for someone for help? Yeah. When is the red flag where I need to call for help? Yeah.
Right. So I think my slightly privileged perspective on this is really that you should seek help even before you need help. Um, and what that means is really to be part of the different type of services, even before you are formally part of the services. So seeking out preventive services such as counseling, health screening, different types of like so-called like breast cancer screening. You have your different health screening kind of stuff. So getting involved in all these type of screenings is already reaching out to get help of some form, because if anything is picked up during these times, then you will be able to seek help as early as possible. So with mental health issues specifically, the earlier you can get help, the higher chance of you being able to walk out of it with minimal damage to your entire life is higher as well, because a lot of times the treatment gap for mental health issues tend to be very large. And I think based on the recent study, the largest one was 10 years for alcohol abuse, alcohol substance use issues. And that's a huge treatment gap. And treatment gap refers to the time from which the onset of the disorder is arriving to the point where people actually seek help. So 10 years is a super long period of time to be experiencing such a condition but not even getting the help that you require. And I think for some of the other conditions, it's about 4 years, 6 years, and that's not a very short period of time to live with. And some of these conditions can be very debilitating and continue to take a toll on you, especially if you're not receiving the support that you require. So I would say we're actually making quite a lot of efforts everywhere. I think even now the GPs have started to get involved in mental health services. You can actually go to a GP and get screened for some of these common mental health problems. You can go to a polyclinic as well, whereby there are trained people in the polyclinic to do so. And in general, the shift towards early intervention is definitely the main focus now. And hopefully we will reach a point where it becomes even more preventive in nature, whereby we start engaging people even earlier, pre-disorder period. And when they are well, how can we keep them well? How can we help them to be able to identify some of the early signs and all that kind of stuff? Yeah. So I think the best time to seek help is before you need help. And I think if we can all do that, then it would really reduce the burden on the broader healthcare landscape in the long term as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I totally agree with Kai again. Seek help before you need help. This should be a sticker. Totally agree with it. Yeah. And indeed, Kimberly, it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge that help is needed. And it's okay not to be okay, right, Evelyn? That's exactly true. And so when we talk about the signs and symptoms, what are some of the things that we should look at? Probably if you can give us some, in our behavior that when we start to have that awareness that what are some of the things that we would want to look at, and in terms of you're talking about screening and so on, right? How often should we do the screening? Yeah.
Right. So I think for some people who are a bit more in tune with themselves, it's a bit more obvious when help they need when they need to seek help. Um, But I would say the best indicator that is not a symptom specific or even disorder specific is when your behaviors, your thoughts start to change. And if you're starting to notice it or people start to point it out around you, then these are some of the signs that you may need to stop and take a look more closely at. Perhaps there's an underlying issue that you may not have resolved. And why I often use this as a baseline is because most of the time, when you wait for formal symptoms to develop, you're already going down the hill of getting the entire condition already. So by being able to identify subtle changes in your thoughts, in your mood, in your behaviors. For example, if you are the kind who every day goes out and run after work or something, but suddenly you don't feel like doing it for many days in a row. So this is a subtle change that may seem like nothing, but it could be indicative of something that's a bit deeper, something that needs to be addressed. Or for example, if you're the kind who can always be very focused and you're able to do your work, able to perform, and then one day you wake up and then you don't feel like going to work anymore, you don't feel like even getting out of bed anymore, or that's a bit more extreme. But if even like you look at your work and you don't feel inspired to do it anymore, these are certain more even subtler signs that you can potentially look out for that may need you to address before they become even worse or they spiral to something deeper.
Right. So it's actually you don't want to go out for a run for a long time. It's a sign. It's just not pure tiredness or laziness. To some people, I think, oh, I'm just feeling lazy. Actually, it's more than that, and it's just more not. It's really more than just Monday blues when you really don't want to wake up and do work and it continuously happen, right? Yeah. So we have 5 more minutes left of Facebook
but
friends.
I think it depends on your original baseline.
So it's really depending on we are usually very motivated, and that's this switch.
Yeah, correct. It's a change that you are not expecting or you have not intentionally made, and that's something to pick up on.
Yeah, it's the change that we have to be aware of, right? Yeah. So thank you for clarifying. And at our Facebook audience, do you have any other comments or questions? We still have the next 4 minutes. And well, leading to our next question, Jonathan, after identifying all these factors, right? What maybe you can share with us, what are 3 simple strategies for maintaining one's total wellness, or anything that, a total wellness initiative have in terms of preventative measures?
Right. So I think by being very proactive, that's probably the biggest thing that you can do. So by actively monitoring yourself, that's one of the best ways that you can maintain your well-being. So we also do have a lot of guides. So let me just share my slide.
Please
Yeah,
share with us
so
some of your
we
guides.
do have many infographics and information that can be used out there, many tools that you can use. So between meditation, mindfulness, all the way to thought reframing exercises and journaling prompts and all that kind of stuff, these are certain more actionable things that you can use, but also it's really up to you to identify what works for you and what doesn't. So I think it's important that you kind of recognize that wellness is different for everyone, and that ultimately you have to decide for yourself what kind of wellness you wish to engage in. Yeah, so it's really a lot of self-awareness and intentionality in basically securing your own well-being.
Yeah, so our well-being is really our own responsibility, and we need to be really aware of it. So yes, thank you so much for this link, and I think our friends are also putting in some of the links in our Facebook chat to have a look at them, understand a little bit more about wellness, and we can totally take responsibility, be empowered, and make a change. So any other last questions do we have here? Yeah, so we have another 2 more minutes. Yeah, otherwise, thank you everyone for all your good questions, and what an enlightening evening. Definitely, we definitely have had a better understanding of what mental health is, wellness, and total wellness with the 10 dimension. And it can be something that we can pluck off and really see where else we want to improve on and work on. And thank you, Jonathan, for the tips, and most importantly, we can really do something to make a difference in our life and total wellness. Yeah. So exactly like what GD said, I really like this. We go to doctor if our organs are sick. We must do so for our mental health too. That is so right, so true. Yeah. So we really do hope to see you again for a lot of our many events that's coming up, and we have planned entirely for this Aphasia Awareness Month celebration. So let me just share with everyone, our Facebook audience here. We do have our human library with Lim Hai-Yen. Yeah, that's on 19th of June 2022. It's free and it's via Zoom. And next up, we have before I show you the next poster, this is something that I'm really interested to attend, because she's going to share with us how a playwright who has aphasia and lost her words is able to cope with with her life again. Yeah, so do come in to listen to her, and it's going to be this Sunday, 19th of June. And next up, Jonathan did just now talk about conversation is more than just talking. So here we have a session on how to communicate better with persons with neurological condition. It's a caregiver workshop, and anyone who is interested is welcome as well. It's going to be on 26th of June. It's also a Sunday, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. and it is in Suchi Humanistic Youth Center. That is where it's a physical session. Yeah, do come in, register, and it's really free for members of the public. And non-chronological order. So yes, this coming Tuesday on the 21st of June, we do have IG Live. Just now, Jonathan talked about music, right? So we have a music therapist here, and you can ask him anything, any burning questions that you have about music therapy, and even a little bit about how music can lift up your mood. And on the 23rd of June, which is our next Connecting the Dots on Thursday, 23rd of June, we have a movie club where we'll talk about Bruce Willis and his aphasia, and what is happening, and we're going to view some of his shows and discuss about that. And the next session on 30th of June, which is also Thursday for Connecting the Dots, we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Chan Yao, and we want to know what does the doctor think about aphasia, and understand a little bit deeper. Yeah. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and tuning in, and thank you so much, Jonathan. Yeah, so this is from us, Aphasia SG, and because communication is a basic human right. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. See you.